Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is lecture 22, Leaders and Followers. All right, in lecture 21 was a bonus lecture called Learning the Hard Stuff at Work. Recall that we talked about how do you learn. We described what we meant by the hard stuff, and that included navigating the complexity of people, uncovering the implicit job, finding shared understanding. And then we talked about ways in which you could increase your engagement, and finally, something arguably even more challenging, how to increase the engagement of others. All right, today is the start of Chapter 8, and Chapter 8 is about leadership, and we're going to ground that chapter talking about leaders and followers, and get into more detail as we get into the second lecture. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about what is leadership and what is followership. What do we mean by followership? That's not really a term you hear a lot. What's the purpose of leaders? And we're going to revisit again hierarchies and networks. I don't know how many times I've said those words in these lectures so far, but it's very relevant in workplaces, and it's very appropriate to talk about to understand leaders and followers. And we're going to talk about power and influence, and then we'll talk about what it means to have effective leadership, and then we'll also talk along those lines about ineffective leadership. Okay, so let's get started. What is leadership? Tried to pick the least polarizing president. Going back a while, it says I could have gone to maybe Herbert Walker, Bush the Elder. Maybe was also. I mean, it's impossible to pick a relatively modern president and not have it fairly polarized. But I hope all of you agree that presidents represent examples of leadership, and based upon your own lifetime experience with somebody like the President of the United States or other politicians, you probably see good and bad aspects of their leadership, and that should give you a sense for just the complexity of leadership, because obviously trying to lead people, and people are ridiculously complex. All right, so what is leadership? There's a couple different ways of looking at it, but maybe at a 50,000 foot or 100,000 foot elevation, or the coarsest grain, you're talking about influence in an organization socially, which really is to say people influencing people in organizations. Organizations can be broad, it can be within the organization, it can be organization to organization, but generally speaking, any type of leadership can be nested within this kind of a broad definition. Another way of looking at it, a little bit more mechanistic, it's a hierarchic position, common to social animals. When it comes to humans, like almost everything humans, our culture is such a combinatorial explosion of variety that we often abstract out lots of stuff, whereas in a social animal situation, it's at least from our vantage point, watching them, leaders tend to be a little bit more obvious and a lot less dimensional in how they display their leadership. But humans are social animals, just like meerkats, and it's tough to describe leadership without, by definition, describing at least some sort of hierarchic position amongst the social animals, hence the word influence. Even more casual, it defines who's in charge, and that really means who gets to make certain decisions. Decision rights may or may not be probably isn't a term that you've heard, but it is a relevant term that is used, and it's also a nice concept. Decision rights. Who has the right to make which decisions? What are the decision rights of parents versus their children, and at what age? And then, of course, there's a lot of variability in terms of what parents decide of the decision rights they're going to keep and which ones they're going to, allow their kids to mature into. And then in an organization, like how much money can you spend? That's a common thing. Can you buy something? Can you order something in your job without having to get an approval, other than you fill out a form and do what's called like a purchase order? Or does that purchase order have to be approved? Or are you at a level where you can approve somebody else's purchase order? For instance, often you first of all have a first layer of approval of, if you want to buy something for work, you typically you'll fill out a purchase order, and some supervisor will sign it, if you're not buying it directly with like your corporate credit card or whatever. But that might work if it's like $500 or $1,000. But if it gets to be $5,000 or $10,000, usually there's another layer, or a higher supervisor or manager has to sign it. And then if you get into spending even more money, you usually get higher up. So that's a concrete example of how decision rights have a hierarchy in themselves. But a lot of decision rights are more subtle than that. Does a group that makes a consensus get to decide what happens in an organization, or does a manager actually have to approve it, or does a manager simply have a veto power? There's a lot of complexity to this, but if you really start thinking about decisions in terms of who and has the authority to make the decision rights, it'll tell you a lot about how leadership works in your organization, how much hierarchy matters, how much agency, autonomy is granted or not. So interesting conceptualization in decision rights. A leader, typically, that's having social influence, usually has characteristics that align with the culture. That's just another way of saying that the leader typically understands the subtlety of the culture, is typically a good model of the behavior, the normative behavior of the culture, and that might be the broader culture, or it might be the specifics of the organizational culture. Usually, for effectiveness, it's both. So as an example, in Western countries, especially in like the United States, we have a short hierarchical distance. I've talked about this before. We tend to not like titles as formalisms. We tend to not like too overt displays of deference. We are individuals, and it doesn't matter who you are or what you do. You have the same right to exist, the same freedoms, the same moral worth. But in other cultures, and certainly in older cultures too, hierarchical distance was a big deal. You may have gotten to the point where you couldn't even make eye contact with certain people. So those are extreme examples. But even though we are a fairly casual, low hierarchical distance culture in the United States, we still have lots of normative expectations about what constitutes respect. That's a top down or bottom up. Within a hierarchy, what constitutes rudeness or insubordination? What are the displays of support? There's a lot of interesting complexity to it. So it can have multiple dimensions, and there's a lot of different ways in which social influence can show up, and this should make sense. It's pretty straightforward. So there's formal social influence, and then there's various informal stuff that you don't really think about it until it happens. And I guess if you think about some of it's sort of happening in front of your eyes in the modern social media culture with this emergence of influencers. That's a little bit more overt than the kind of informal social influence I'm talking about. But just modeling behavior, doing something that, dressing nice, acting in a certain manner, all that has social influence, negative or positive. But whether it's formal or informal, usually has to do with whether the organization is sort of asking for it or expecting it or rating it, or is it very explicit about it. All right, other forms of, explicit and implicit at this point should be this, hopefully, despite my couple tangents trying to make it more complicated than it is, hopefully these basic concepts are something we all kind of understand, and hopefully you guys have a good grounding in just what leadership is. So, but another Another interesting thing that you may or may not have ever heard of is this reality distortion fields, and that's sort of like a really strong social influence. And that's, I mean, when it's pathologized, it can take the form of things like gaslighting. Steve Jobs, the former CEO and one of the original co-founders of Apple, was famous for this, and the term was really kind of coined around him, and that's this very powerful, charismatic, visionary way that a leader, in this case the top leader of an organization, just sort of insists that reality is a certain way so strongly that people get on board. For better or for worse. In the case of folks like Steve Jobs, it often created a sense of the belief in what was possible, of something that people might have thought was too ambitious or too hard or wouldn't work. Like, hey, I want to take all the buttons off of the phones. That was a big deal. And people went along with folks like Steve Jobs saying, no, this is the right way to do it. And he was so charismatic and visionary. Charismatic is not just glad-handing. It's also, typically the kinds of reality distortion ability is something that comes with like a deep faith and trust that you have in a person. And, frankly, since I have a president on this slide, and we saw a lot of this happening in the Trump administration, and I'm going to walk a careful line here. But just to point out that, he spent his lifetime, saying things and it's an interesting phenomenon. If you say something and really, really believe it, and if the thing you're saying is somebody else wants to believe, and we really have this weird compartmentalization that, like, we hear it again and again, or even when we hear ourselves say it, it actually can start to distort. We start to get a sort of a ring of truth to something. If it's repeated enough, but that's probably enough navigating political waters here. Let's get back to work. All right, so for those of you who are listening and watching this on video, as opposed to maybe the other half of class that I think just reads the slides, you will be blessed by having decided to watch this video, because the stuff on this followership book will not be on the test. So it's followership. It's the extent to which you follow others, the extent to which you're pro-social, that you're agreeable, that you have affiliative behavior. Those things inherently don't necessarily make you a follower, but I mean, good followership is you're trying to go along. You want harmony, you want to follow, you don't want to disrupt. To some extent, you're with the whole decision rights and hierarchy. To some extent, you're subordinating your will to others. What the group wants or what the leader wants. It's not about you, and your behavior is driving group alignment and group harmony. And you're buying into your role in the organization. You're buying the binding narrative, and those things, that can be for good or for bad. But if you want a highly aligned organization, you need good followership, and you need people that recognize that the role they have is important and believe in it, and recognize the narrative that's binding the group together, that helps define the culture, that says what kind of an organization, what kind of company are we, who are we that work at the company, what are our values. The more you align with that, the more you buy into that, the better the organization behaves as a aligned whole. There's a little bit more detailed way of looking at it that comes from this book that I just thought was interesting to share, that some people have looked at this a little bit further and taxonomized it. I'm not endorsing or not endorsing. I just thought it would be interesting to share that Barbara Kellerman in her book Followership put a taxonomy to this, that not all followership is the same, which should ring true. That you have people that are sort of going along, but they're definitely not in. They're not going along to getting along. They're just sort of in the corner. So we'll just go through this list of the types of followership that she outlined. So there's isolates, those are the people that are just in the corner. They're completely disengaged from the organization. They don't want to have any attention to themselves. They might be barely working. They're certainly not helping. They're just getting a paycheck, so to speak. And there's bystanders, which is like maybe one step better than that, in that you can see them. They're not trying to hide. But when you do see them, they're definitely not, and they're not speaking up. They're not volunteering. They're just sort of going along in a visible way, but they're just sort of observers. And then there's participants, and that's kind of the middle of the road. These people are engaged. They're generally supportive. And then you get into activists, and those are people that are starting to push their own agency, push their own will. They tend to be eager and energetic. And again, this can be for good if everything's lined up, or it could be stretching the organization into different directions if the activism is not aligned. And then because engagement itself just kind of means energetic commitment to a direction you want to go. And the trick of good leadership is to try to get that maximum engagement, try to get that maximum energy, that will within your employees, but to have them all on the same page and agreeing to go to the same direction. And then they have the diehards, and those are people that are just extremely devoted to the in-group that is the organization. And the danger there is, sometimes that can be actually directed towards leadership. If somebody that's deeply faithful, loyal to what they see as their organization, and then leaders want to go and change things, they actually can view their leaders as a direct threat to what they hold dear in their organization. And that happens a lot when a leader comes in or emerges that is trying to change things, often because things are going really bad, or the market's going bad, or whatever. And so the leader needs to disrupt things. The leader's trying to institute transformational change. A lot of times, if you don't get buy-in from the diehards, they will fight you, and often those diehards know everything about the organization, and they really know how to get the organization against you. Just because you're in charge in theory doesn't mean that you'll be able to turn the ship. If all of the ship's mechanics and stewards and everybody else thinks that where you want to go is a bad deal, they'll figure out ways to fight you, directly or indirectly. So anyway, interesting concept. None of these bolded items are going to be on the test, but it adds some richness to this discussion. Okay, what is the purpose of leaders? First of all, they're telling the story. They're helping make sure that we're all on the same page, we're all lined up in the same direction, we all agree on who we are, what our purpose is, what's our organization stand for, where are we heading, what's the landscape that we're in. Are we an organization that stands for the best quality, the best customer service, the most innovation? Do we always stick by our customers thick and thin? Do we always stay true to a certain nature of our brand, or are we always on the cutting edge, or whatever? And then it might not just be, we always try to make the most money, and we always grow. There might be like a stakeholder capitalism element to it in the terms of businesses, where what's our higher purpose? We want to be innovative, but we want to be sustainably innovative, whatever it is. Within an organization, if you're doing a good job as a leader, you're helping to establish and foster that binding narrative. That's the shared fiction of the in-group. And how do you make sure that whatever is the binding narrative is what it ought to be, and not one that just sort of emerges on its own? Because if you're not intentional about this, you'll often have competing binding narratives, just like you have competing ideologies in broader culture. You'll have competing frameworks of understanding within your own organization that result in arguments within your organization about who you are and where you should go. And then you have misalignment, and then the people are working at cross purposes, and so you're wasteful. All right, so that brings us into this concept of alignment. If you have sheep, and this isn't meant to be a negative. What you're trying to do is get an organization to move in a way that, you know, sheep will move, which is that they all kind of pay attention to what their neighbors are doing, and they want to, at least to some extent, stay aligned, as opposed to cats. You know, it's an expression, herding cats. You know, you don't really herd cats. They do whatever the hell they want. And a cat herd is an expression to meaning that you're trying to get a whole bunch of people with different attitudes, different direction, different agendas, you know, to all be on the same page. And that's rather difficult and very inefficient. And you know, to think about what that means, if you have people that are misaligned, you're wasting resources. So this bullet here is an important concept that I'd like you to at least to think about here, and that is the team of average people will typically beat a team of exceptional people if the average people are aligned and the exceptional people are not. So grab a group of people that all got C's on the test, so to speak, but if they are all willing to work together and be highly aligned and to accept their position and accept the binding narrative and all work towards it, that typically does way better than you grab your best and brightest and most ambitious and smartest A++ people. If those people, you know, have you know, too much opinion about where things ought to go and not enough willingness to give ground. So you have a bunch of super highly motivated, successful super geniuses that just cannot agree. They'll be beaten typically on actions that require you know, group effort. So a lot, and the ideal is you get the super performers to also be super aligned, and that's actually very challenging. It does happen in pockets, but anyway, the important part here is that alignment itself is a superpower of a group, and it is arguably the most important purpose of the leader is alignment and in the direction that you need to go. I mean, a bunch of highly aligned people that are going in the exact opposite direction can speed up the failure of an organization. So obviously, you want people going in the right direction. Anyway, hopefully this is making sense. The purpose of a leader is to drive change. So sometimes the binding narrative is no longer fitting because the world has changed, the market's changed, the business, your business has changed, technology has caused everything to change, and now the notion of we want to be the lowest cost producer, we want the best customer service, we want whatever, you know, that might not be working anymore. Because your products are old and stale, in which case you need to right the ship a little bit. You need to bring some innovation. You need to bring some change. Your brand maybe took a hit in the market, or some stupid decisions by some leaders caused the brand to be damaged, and you need to sort of refresh your brand. You're talking about changes to the binding narrative, trying to get the alignment in another direction to try to pivot. So change is a huge part. Another part is risk management. You know, by holding leaders accountable for the mistakes of the group, you sometimes get one person who sort of feels the risk of a decision, and when it's done right, you can actually kind of have an opposing force to bad groupthink, or otherwise just a check on things, so that we should double check something. You know, obviously it can go too far, and you can have a leader so risk averse that nothing moves. But a large part of leadership is risk management, and then there's also sort of intangibles. There's things that cultures expect of leaders. You know, we have a tendency to mythologize leaders. All right, continued in talking a little bit more here on what's the function. So we talked about the purpose. This is more a different way of looking at it. You know, what is it a leader does? And in the late 40s, there were these there were studies in Ohio State that looked at leadership, and they broke it into 2 dimensions, and these will be 2 dimensions similar to things that we keep seeing again and again. And one is that a leader can have consideration, is the term they use. That's why it's bolded. And you know, while the stuff on followership would not be on the test, you know, something like this is, and the stuff in this general part of the lectures probably going to have a question or two. So a leader that's aware of their subordinates, a leader that fosters participation at all levels, that's considered consideration. But the other side is a little more nuts and bolts. What does a leader do to define what needs to be done, to direct people to the work, to organize that work, and that's called initiating structure. So another way of looking at this is if you recall from lecture 2 on the history, you had Taylorism and scientific management. And then you had what eventually became called like the human resources era. And then when we talked about job analysis and we talked about task versus KSAOs, that's the what and that versus the how. And so some of that is right here again. So the initiating structure is sort of the what. This is sort of the scientific management. This is what's the work and how do you make sure the work gets done? How is it structured? How do you know it's the right work to do? How do you get a bunch of disparate people to all do things at the proper sequence so that things work? And then the how, or the human relations side or the humanistic side, that's the how do you get people to be agents in their own lives? How do you get people to act in a cooperative manner so that you get the best of the wisdom of the crowds and you get the best of the people at the actual front line, so to speak, the working level, so to speak. And both of these dimensions should never be looked at as a totally either or, but different roles and different situations and different people end up at different balances of this. But this whole what versus how thing, human relations versus Taylorism, scientific management, consideration versus initiating structure. These things come up again and again, and there's reasons for that should be pretty obvious at this point. There's also a dysfunction. We talked about the function of leaders. Well, sometimes leaders have dysfunction, and so there's this thing called the Pygmalion effect, and that's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is generally looked at as something that can be a dysfunction, but in some ways this can be a positive. So this is really where if a leader has certain expectations of a subordinate, if a leader looks at a person and says, I look at that person and that person's lazy, and not trustworthy, they're dumb, or I'm using coarser words than would typically happen in an organization. But if a leader expects a certain type of behavior because they've classified somebody, labeled them in a box in their minds, they often will treat them in a way they can if they're poor leaders, treat them in a way that reduces the optionality of the person, and actually sort of creates the behavior that they're predicting. If they think somebody's lazy, they might not even give the person the time of day, might not give the person opportunities, and then the person will feel like their leader doesn't care, and their leader doesn't think much of them, and that person might be like, well, screw that, man. I guess I'm not working very hard. Well, which caused which? That's the rub on this of the Pygmalion effect. If you have negative expectations, the reverse can happen. I mean, where you have positive expectations and you act and communicate that, and that can be its own feedback loop that's positive. So it isn't always dysfunctional, and you really think about how your personal expectations might be actually affecting others, especially if you're in a leadership position. So Pygmalion effect can be a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle or circle, depending upon whether your expectations are good or bad. All right, well, we can't seem to have a lecture without talking about hierarchies and networks, it seems. So what does that relate in terms of leaders and followers? Well, let's dig into this term a little bit, and this term hierarchy, and we'll dig into this term network a little bit. So there are lots of ways that hierarchies emerge. This isn't just a hierarchy in like a social animal where it's who's the strongest and meanest gets to be in charge. Hierarchies are really multidimensional, and they're not just about authority. Some of the important things to realize is if you get a group of people, if there aren't well-established hierarchies, you will get well-established, or at least competing hierarchies. They will form spontaneously, just like norms and norm enforcement will emerge if they're not already well-established. So there's a lot of social hierarchies, and they often overlap simultaneously. So there's a simple way of taxonomizing them that I find useful. You can certainly complexify this and ramify it into all sorts of stuff. But I think if you just look at it as these three types of hierarchies for now, as a good introduction to this concept, that it could be useful for your understanding. And that's to think of as competence, dominance, or prestige hierarchies. And you'll see all three of these at play in your life, in your social group, writ large across our culture, and you'll definitely see them in the workplace. So a competence hierarchy, and again, these have many dimensions, because competence in what? Is this competence in your coworker's ability to understand the types of tasks that you both do, or is it competence in a friend's ability to play guitar better than you, or your ability to juggle better than your friends? Whatever it is, this is an ability. This can be skill. This can be knowledge. So anything in the KSAO, this can be competence in performing a task. So, and we sort of intuitively and to some extent automatically develop senses for these in the areas that we care about, or in the areas that our culture seems to care about. So competence hierarchies should be pretty clear what that means. And then dominance hierarchy is often where people immediately go when they think hierarchies, and this is sort of an evolutionary perspective where you think hierarchy and you think who's in charge. Hierarchies aren't about necessarily who's in charge. And when you talk about leaders and followers, there's that dimension to it. But who's the better guitar player? Who's got the better memory? Who's the better who can hold their breath the most? None of those are related to decision rights or who's in charge. So there's lots of dimensions to hierarchies. But now we're talking about dominance, and dominance is where there's some sort of authority or there's some sort of ability that results in influence. So this is about influence. This is about power, formally or informally. And then there's another way of looking at hierarchy, and that's in terms of status, and those are often called prestige hierarchies. So these three concepts seem to fit the vast manifestations of hierarchies. How competent you are at something, how dominant you are in a situation, and often this will be formalized in an org chart, but it can exist in many other forms as well, but it's sort of an influence ranking. And then prestige is about status. So how rich you are, how many friends you have, many ways of looking at prestige hierarchies. And people who can try to climb, the number of hierarchies that you could identify in your social life are immense, but you can generally classify them into these three. And if you find a number of hierarchies that you don't feel can classify into those three, by all means, please include that in your bonus extra credit submissions, even though this isn't a bonus lecture. And if you convince me that there needs to be a fourth one, I'll add another 10 points to that. Anyway, so this is valuable. I think this is valuable in ways of looking at hierarchies. And I would encourage you to kind of open up your mind and see where you can see these in your life. And I would also strongly encourage you not to fall to dimensionally reduced cartoon versions of things when you especially in the culture right now, and especially within the culture wars, where things often get characterized as simple hierarchies, as though there's only one version of a hierarchy, and that it's all dominance. Dominance hierarchies absolutely exist, and people have done terrible things to maintain their privilege and order, or to establish order, or to fight for their worldview, and they used and established and used dominance hierarchies to do that. But prestige hierarchies and competence hierarchies are absolutely at play as well, and they tend to be very important. Especially competence hierarchies is arguably far more important than dominance hierarchies at work. And to some extent, the pathway to a dominance hierarchy position at work, the pathway to having more decision rights, is the demonstration of competence. So the climbing of one hierarchy can result in the climbing of another. It's interesting things. Okay, let's talk about networks. Networks are also multidimensional, and they will also form spontaneously. The interesting thing is what network you're connected to can be a form of its can be itself put into a hierarchy. And that could be a prestige hierarchy. What club are you part of, or the in group, the cool group, and all that sort of stuff, or the network you might be a part of can have a lot of influence, and actually could assert some level of dominance. So these things are this concept of hierarchy and network are, when you really dig into it, you can't have one without the other. And at some level they're entangled, and at some level you really can't figure out where one begins and the other one ends. And in fact, networks that, if a network establishes itself and starts to have legs, it starts to become large and complex, within that forming network, hierarchies will emerge. So interesting, fascinating stuff. So like leadership, networks can also be formal. They can be informal, and they can be explicit and implicit. All right, so hopefully this is not too detailed, and hopefully this is interesting to you. Let's talk about power and influence a little bit, and it's sort of the nature of power. It's just different types of power, and in some aspect of this, just like previous couple slides, there's aspects of this will be on the test too. Power can be legitimate, which is to say it's actually an organization, an in-group, recognizes it, formally recognizes it. It might have even formality and displays associated with the role. Power can typically be power can be bestowed. Okay, so which is to say, I give you this power because I'm putting you in charge. Power can also come from the ability to give out rewards. So I'm going to buy my way into I'm going to buy your loyalty. And so I can influence people with incentives. But at the same time, I can come in and coerce. So you can have the ability to use force, and various kinds of force or consequences. It doesn't have to be physical force, but coercive power. So these three types of power, legitimate, formal, recognized stuff, the ability to dole out rewards for power, or the ability to dole out force, those are often bestowed, which is to say some organization, some in-group, some recognized thing that has its own kind of power grants or gives or backs you up in this. But other types of power can be earned. And so you can have referent power, which is when people like you. So you can, if you're in a dictatorship, you can get people to act like they like you, but it's actually, if you actually truly want them to like you, you got to do other stuff, and it has to be earned. And it can be earned through deception and all sorts of other things. But I mean, you have to get people to choose. You have to get people to associate you with certain things so that they like you. So referent power needs to be earned. Information is typically an earned power, which is to say people have to understand, and you have to establish yourself as a source of good information. You've got the goods, you know the secrets, you've got the good gossip. You're always the most helpful at doing stuff. You know the most about a subject. You're the walking Google, whatever it is. Information itself has power. But holding and disseminating information is something you have to cultivate, grow, and then convince others that you have it. So that's why it's looked at as power that is typically earned. And a manifestation of that can be expertise, which is a little bit different than, you've got the gossip on something. So not all information is considered expertise, but and expertise itself could be, you are the best person at leather work, whatever it is. I mean, it doesn't have to be information based. This could be task specific, but it also could be knowledge based. So you have unique and valuable, this is knowledge, but you could view this as skills as well. Okay, influence is really how power is used. So again, social influence. Influence is really just you getting somebody to do something, and typically, and you want them to do it, or an organization full of all sorts of somebodies. you know, or whatever. It's, you know, influence is typically the whole point of power. So you can look at what's most useful of all those bolded items. Generally speaking, the ones that are most useful for gaining influence over people. I mean, you can have the power to hurt somebody, okay? And, you know, did you influence them? If you just if a dictator just up and grabs somebody that they don't like and shoots them, is that influence? Nah, not. It depends on what you really mean. But when you talk about the kind of influence that matters in the workplace, social influence, generally speaking, expertise, you know, legitimate recognition, and reference. So to be granted authority, to be liked, and to be considered to have expertise. Those three things are generally considered to be the most useful at influence. Interesting stuff. All right, so what are effective leadership outcomes? Well, in other words, if you have a leader and they're being effective, what's the outputs? What changes in the organization? So, in one outcome of good leadership is that you maintain your alignment. You have a good binding narrative, and the folks are moving in a uniform direction. Another good outcome is that you avert crises, or if you stumble on, or a crisis stumbles upon you, you manage those crises. So you make sure the ship doesn't sink. And another good outcome is the people in the organization are highly engaged. You know, and ideally the people give their all to an organization, and within reason, of course. Retention is high. You keep your people, and the converse of that, by definition, you know, turnover is low. You know, people typically leave, you know, when they don't like their boss. It isn't to say if they do like their boss, they will always stay. I mean, if the pay sucks and everything else about the organization is terrible, but even if things are pretty good, and you just don't like your boss, that's often a reason itself to leave. So the leader themselves can have a big impact on turnover, for good and for ill. And so another thing of good leadership is the organization behaves in such a way that it gets a good reputation. When you're trying to recruit somebody, all of their experiences are positive, both with you, if you're the leader, and the various people in the organization. And so recruiting people becomes better, more successful. So a great leader will build a reputation. Sometimes change has to happen. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a crisis. But it could be you're trying to prevent a market share loss, or you're trying to improve your products or your services, or whatever it is. You need to manage change, and that you know, you're pivoting, you're evolving in a critical way for the success of the organization, and the overall outcome is that the organization thrives. So, what are some effective leadership traits? And we'll talk a little bit more in next lecture as well about leadership traits. So a lot of this lecture and the next lecture will have a lot of overlap, but we'll talk about it in different ways. Obviously, cognitive abilities, you know, the ability to learn, ability to think on your feet, ability to communicate. These are all, you can argue whether communication belongs in cognitive abilities, but really, I mean, good verbal fluence, ability to understand the situation. You know, thinking on your feet is often demonstrated by good communication. Social skills, the ability to regulate yourself, the ability to kind of understand what your behaviors should or shouldn't be in a given social situation. The ability to have good empathy, to read people, and then to know how you should behave. All of these are what makes leaders more effective. Having confidence, you know, having a leader that has good self-efficacy, owns their agency. If they have imposter syndrome, it doesn't make them freeze up. They act anyway, in a calm and confident manner. Confidence is reassuring, which is to say it is assuring people that things are all right, everything's going to be fine, and the uncertainty you're feeling is nothing to be concerned about, because I'm your leader, and we're gonna go and we're gonna figure this stuff out. So this is in war when mortar shells are popping around, and your lieutenant or your sergeant is still calm, even if they're yelling at you to do something. You don't hear fear in their voice, and you hear and there's a resolve and a certainty. If you're in an uncertain situation and your leader is displaying uncertainty or lack of confidence in themselves, which is itself sort of a kind of uncertainty of themselves, so to speak, that's off-putting, and that drives its own uncertainty to the people being led, and creates anxiety, negative affect, all sorts of stuff. So confidence is an important leadership trait. You don't want the type of confidence that communicates, if there's a crisis, if your ship hit an iceberg, and it hit an iceberg, and your leaders and the captain is just quietly, confidently saying everything's going to be fine. That's runs incongruous to what you're experiencing. So that might not be reassuring. But if the captain says, we're in a difficult situation, but that's what we have lifeboats for. We're going to move in an orderly manner, and displays confidence. That's an effective leadership trait. So another thing is knowledge. The more the leader understands about your job, their job, the organization, understands the situation, those are things that make them effective. And there's actually appearance elements. There's an element of theater. There's an element of modeling behavior. There's an element of a leader setting a tone. So to some extent, acting the part is expected. And if you have a leader that sort of is always in shambles and looks like crap, doesn't hold themselves together, that's a performative act that basically is manifesting a disorderliness or a lack of care. So there's a reason why there are performative aspects of leadership, and that people certainly sometimes substitute competence for appearance, and people smell that, and get cynical about that. But if you have abilities, and you have knowledge, and you have confidence, and you have social skills, and then you look the part as well, that's just sort of the full package, so to speak. So let's get into a little bit of detail here, the different types of leaders, starting with supervisors, and then we'll talk about mid-level managers and executives, and what are the different ways in which being an effective first-line supervisor versus being an effective like mid-level manager. So typically speaking, a frontline supervisor is effective when they are person-centered and supportive, when they really know what's going on. Think of the sergeant or the corporal. They know everything going on in the lives of the privates, and they act in a supportive way. Maybe that's not a good example when you're talking, when you've seen a few war movies of yelling sergeants, but you know what's going on at the person level. You're having a lot of potentially high empathy interactions, one-on-one at the working level. You're trying to foster it doesn't mean everything's legitimately democratic. Your group doesn't have to vote on everything, but you hear people out, and there's good discourse. You're able to adapt and be flexible. To some extent, you're acting as coaches and not directors, and a frontline supervisor, assuming everybody knows their job. You're working on trying to help them to do their job and encouraging them about things and making suggestions. But a typical frontline supervisor is not saying do this, do that, unless they're in a training mode or something like that. Providing feedback right away. Hey, don't do it that way, do it this way. There you go, good, kind of stuff. But a manager, and moving up to executives, those are typically salaried people leading other salaried people. It tends to be more about the work, and less about the specifics, and less person-to-person interaction. That doesn't mean you can't interact with people. It just means you're not in there going, hey, don't do the spreadsheet that way. Don't label the tab that way. There's a lot of work at the professional level, or some people said the laptop class. That's a term you hear once in a while. There's a level of task autonomy that's expected of professionals, and that managers aren't effective when they're in there micromanaging every little detail. So an effective manager is, talking about the work outputs and not about exactly how you went about doing that at the task level, if that makes sense. A typically effective manager or executive, is conscientious, is definitely stable, agreeable within reason, typically extroverted, so they can communicate well. They try to drive harmony. They're calm and stable, and they work hard. They often have more of a need for achievement and a need for power, less of a need for affiliation. That is to say, they like to be in charge more than they like to be liked. And you absolutely can drive that to the point where it becomes dysfunctional and you become ineffective. But generally speaking, a manager, an executive needs to make sure that people do the right thing, even if that means that they are not universally loved or liked. And they need to be willing to put the directive of, hey, this is where we're going to go now. This is who we are as an organization. This is the way we're changing things, or whatever, even if that means some people, don't like you at that moment. So anyway, these are general things, and there are definitely situations in which the opposite might be true. Typically, an effective manager, executive has good self-control, and to some extent, they also have good self-promoting ability. It doesn't mean that absolutely doesn't mean that they should take credit for things, but they're representing their group, their hierarchy, and if they can't self-promote, if they can't bring attention to them, they often can't bring a necessary attention to their group, which often means they can't bring the appropriate level of resources or cooperation from other groups. So a certain amount of self-promotion, again within reason, is good. All right, so what makes a ineffective leader? And we'll go through the same frontline supervisor versus manager executive thing. So if you don't know what you're doing, how about that? If you haven't had supervision training, or if you just flat up aren't up to the complexity of the role, if you have conflicting loyalties, and one of those can be, your best friend is now works for you, or you have animosity towards somebody, and when you both were working on the front lines, now you're the supervisor, or you can't spend enough time because you have outside conflicts. If you're unwilling to demonstrate the authority you have, or if the organization itself doesn't give you enough authority. And then from mid-level management, again, this is mid-level management of a larger organization, that authority thing ends up being a big problem. If a mid-level manager cannot affect change, if a mid-level manager can't bring the resources or whatever to their people, then they become ineffectual. So insufficient authority, or a manager that can't bring enough resources, and they don't have the authority to spend much money. They don't have enough, decision rights over various support things that a group might need. If they have kind of along these lines, if the policy is coming from higher leaders and there's nothing it seems like there's nothing a mid-level manager can do, and they can't seem to influence that, and often the policy seems heavy-handed. It seems like it's not listening to what people need, and it feels like it's being imposed, and people tend to not like that. Obviously, if they don't understand where the organization actually does the good work, where the value is added, where the money is made, where the proper services are rendered, if they actually think that as managers that what they do is actually the important thing, this is real. I mean, I see this all the time. Tendency to be a mid-level manager, and I've spent a lot of my career as a mid-level manager, where you start to think that your work is actually really important work, and it's not. Your work as a mid-level manager is not why the company exists. Your job is to help create an environment so that the people that are working, are adding value, are interacting with your customers, are designing or building the product, are working on the services for whatever it is your organization does, that they're able to be as effective as possible, that they're fully engaged, that they have what they need, that the barriers are removed in front of them. but it's definitely not about you. And this gets screwed up. This gets reversed all the time. And what happens is a manager thinks that what they do is the important stuff, and they create all sorts of unnecessary work. And this work comes in the form of metrics to make reports, to make spreadsheets, so that the manager can talk about how well the group is doing. I'm not saying you don't need metrics. I'm not saying you don't need to do analysis, but don't kid yourself into thinking that that's actually adding value. It's not. It's actually sucking resources to do that. So you do it only when it's critical that you do it. Otherwise, you focus on making sure you're enabling people at the working level to do the work, and you're otherwise out of their way. And then at the executive level, it's often a personality issue. You end up with ego and vanity. You get executives that think they're better, and sort of let the position go to their heads. And often a failure of an executive, where an executive had to be drummed out of the organization or be given a sort of a golden handcuff or a put to pasture. They have a special assignment and they're no longer the vice president of whatever. Often that is because of the O's in the KSAOs, the other characteristics, and often those are styles and personality driven that just sort of destroy the harmony, destroy the binding narrative, or just fail to maintain it or create a countervailing force. Anyway, often the executives fail for who they are, and obviously they can, some executives are straight up not up to the complexity of the role, and this affects everybody at whatever level of leadership you are. But you can also be unrealistic. You can have a reality distortion field and believe that you know where the company wants to go and be super visionary and basically drive your ship into an iceberg. And you can be abrasive and you can be domineering. You can destroy the trust of an organization. And that's really a personality and style approach. Okay, that's our lecture. Not too bad on time. All right, let's review what we talked about in Lecture 22 in Leaders and Followers. We talked about what is leadership and what is followership. We talked about what the purpose of leaders were. And remember, we talked about function as well and a little bit of dysfunction. We talked about hierarchies and networks, talked about power and influence, and we talked about effective leadership, and that included ineffective leadership, and we looked at that across different levels, typical levels of leaders in an organization. And we're going to dive into the different types of leaders in a lot more detail here in the next chapter. We're going to talk about a little bit more of what we just gave a small sampling of the different levels of leaders in typical organizations, and we're going to dive in a little more detail into types of leaders, a little bit more into the characteristics, and again we're going to revisit traits, but we're also going to look at like certain situations. And we're going to talk about some theories. There'll be some stuff that'll inevitably be on the test here, because this is straight IO psychology stuff on theories of leadership, and we'll talk about leadership styles. And we will talk about what sometimes makes people bad leaders. All right, that's the end of the lecture, and we will see you for Lecture 23.